ways. We've got news stories about war in Ukraine and Palestine. We hear about persecution of our Christian brothers and sisters in the DRC and across the Muslim world. We see nationalism masquerading under the gospel in our own country and in other places as well. We've seen people using the created world, exploiting it for their own ends or worshiping it, right? Trying to put it above human life. And we continue to see a callous disregard for the most vulnerable, for the unborn, for those who might have disabilities, for the elderly. It's not a very pretty picture if we sort of step back and think about the world that we're living in right now. But against that backdrop, I just finished reading the Gospel of Matthew. And one of the things that really struck me about that gospel was God's care for the small. Our small, everyday decisions to show love to someone or to speak the truth in an apparently tiny moment. God's value for children and for each individual coin or sheep. And Christ's emphasis on the smallness of the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, and that's what that is up there. Those are mustard seeds, right? In this context, I'd like to invite you to think of the work of scholar leaders as planting mustard seeds. Each individual theological leader with whom scholar leaders works may appear to be small, and you might wonder, why does it matter that this one person, that we're caring for this one person, against the backdrop of all that darkness, all those big, heavy situations against we feel absolutely powerless. But each of those leaders is beloved by God and powerfully called and equipped by Him and used by Him to bring the light of Christ into those very situations. So if you want to think about scholar leaders, think of scholar leaders as the best friend of mustard seeds, cultivating at first apparently small and insignificant individuals so that they can bring the hope of the gospel into these dark places around the world. So, for example, my coworker Taras in Ukraine is helping to coordinate a network of 10 seminaries that are serving refugees and the displaced across Ukraine. Not only are they doing that, but they have resumed seminary classes and they are training, for example, counselors and chaplains to work with those who are suffering from PTSD and to serve soldiers on the front lines. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Jean Musevuli is a current PhD student researching how the church can respond to persecution. What do you say to a congregation of people who have just seen their pastor beheaded by militants? What do you do in that situation? The last time I talked to Jean, he was experiencing this personally himself because his uncle, who still has 6 grown children at home, had just been kidnapped. And the government is so corrupt that no one was willing to help his family, and they still don't know where he is. In Bulgaria, Radostin Marshev is helping the Christian church think about how to respond to the pressure of Russian nationalism. How do you remain Christian in the face of a state that is telling you that Christianity only looks in a certain nationalistic way? In Brazil, Mariana Schietti is helping the church think about creation care. She's doing a dissertation on Genesis 1, and she's about to graduate, so I'm super excited. And in Guatemala, Sofia Quintanilla is helping to lead a seminary and also helping the church and calling the society to think about how to care for orphaned children. How do you welcome the idea of adoption in a society where that might not be something that's acceptable culturally. Each of these people is a mustard seed that Scholar Leaders is a best friend to, helping them find the resources they need to bring that light of the gospel into dark places. So, what does Scholar Leaders actually do? Let me try to give you a handle on our programs, and then I'll tell you a couple of stories about the ministry. First of all, this year, in the scholarship program, 55 PhD students from 27 countries are receiving scholarships. You can think of this as the doorway or the gateway into that best friend relationship. So we start with these leaders by offering them a scholarship to earn their PhD in theology or a related field. Each of the people who receives a scholarship from SL commits to go back to their home country to serve there. So they do not remain in the West. If they go to the West to study, they return home and they serve in their home country as pastors, counselors, missionaries, evangelists, seminary faculty and staff, and sometimes what we call missional entrepreneurs, and that just means people who start their own organizations, often nonprofits doing really practical hands-on work. So the scholarship program, and this is the program that I direct, is kind of that first step for people. They get a scholarship, they get their PhD, and then they go home to serve. Second, because most of those people do go into a seminary context, they have a PhD after all, right? So they're going to probably go and teach formally in some way. Scholar Leaders has a program that works with seminaries around the world, because seminaries in many of these global contexts are facing a host of challenges that just go beyond what any of us can imagine as we're sitting here in Bloomington this morning. They just come together in so many ways for these contexts. So we run a program where we come alongside these seminaries and help them think about how to respond and thrive in those situations. So this year, 11 seminaries in Nigeria, Ghana, and Ecuador are receiving counsel. But this program has worked with seminaries in Lebanon, Egypt, Nigeria, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Brazil. I mean, it's a global program, right? So the reach is huge. And then finally, Scholar Leaders runs a set of topical programs. Because leaders in these contexts, believe it or not, tend to be fairly isolated. They don't have a lot of resources, so it's hard for them to network well. So Scholar Leaders serves as kind of the handshake. We might say, oh, you're dealing with issues of being a Christian in a Muslim majority context. We're going to introduce you to this other person over here who's also dealing with that. And then we're going to help you work together to figure out how you might respond to some of those concerns. So we have a couple of different topical programs under that umbrella that kind of pop up as we see a need. So these are the basic programs that Scholar Leaders runs: the scholarship program, the seminary counseling program, and then some of these topical programs. Again, I know this might all sound very abstract, so let me tell you a couple of stories. Nigeria, in 2011, had over 80 million Christians. Try to wrap your mind around that. 80 million Christians, and I'm sure the number has only increased since then. Well, a little over 48 years ago, which was just about the time Scholar Leaders was forming, a 17-year-old Nigerian boy was sitting in a first grade classroom. You heard that right. He's 17, he's in a first grade classroom, and he's learning how to read. This young man was Sunday Agam. He'd come to faith at an evangelistic event in 1975, and shortly afterwards, some Christians had given him a copy of the Gospel of John. He was desperate to read the Gospel for himself, right, to learn more about the Christ in whom he had believed, but he didn't know how to read. So he enrolled himself in the first grade. He was both motivated and gifted. He moved quickly from elementary school to high school and then to Bible school. and he became a senior pastor, while he was still in his 20s, reflecting that need, in this context of so many Christians, reflecting that need for educated leadership. Yet, his passion for understanding God's word was still unsatisfied. So he enrolled at Jos Theological Seminary in north central Nigeria. And if you know anything about northern Nigeria, you know that it's a flashpoint area for conflict between Christians and Muslims, still, right now. After graduating from seminary, he served in church leadership and then earned his MDiv. And yes, you heard that right, he was serving as a senior pastor earlier without an MDiv, just with a basic Bible school degree. That's the situation in a lot of these contexts. So he earned his MDiv, and with his new degree in hand, he went to join that seminary in Jos in north central Nigeria as faculty. But that seminary needed faculty with PhDs because they wanted to keep training leaders at a higher level. So they sent Sunday to the United States to earn his PhD. And that's where Scholar Leaders came in. He had a scholarship from Scholar Leaders to earn that PhD in California. Now, even before he'd started earning his PhD, Sunday had a passion for Christian ethics. He didn't just know Jesus, he wanted to live like Jesus. So he founded a ministry called Gowon Ministries, a nonprofit that cares for widows and orphans. And that ministry quickly gained notoriety in the community because it served Christian and Muslim orphans equally, which is almost unheard of in a situation like that. But they were serving Christian and Muslim widows equally. In fact, they were so well known for doing that when a group of Muslim militants was moving through the city hunting down Christians, Muslim leaders took Sunday and his family and hid them to protect them from the impending destruction, because he had so earned their love and trust through his service. Well, Sunday finished his PhD and went back to that seminary in north central Nigeria, where he became the academic dean. And he's serving to train pastors for that Christian-Muslim situation, right? So Scholar Leaders came alongside him again. This time, Scholar Leaders is working through that topical program. We developed a curriculum to help train pastors to understand Islam, not from a polemical perspective, which would only put you in danger, nor from a perspective of saying that Christ and Muhammad are equal, but from a respectful perspective of grace and truth, so that the Christians who are working and leading in that situation can minister to their Muslim neighbors with that same love and gospel faithfulness that Sunday was already practicing. Well, after a few years, the denomination sent Sunday to become president of a nearby sister seminary in Kagoro. He served there for 2 terms as that school's president before returning to Jos as its president, a role that he continues to fill today. And, as you might expect, the seminary program is helping Sunday's seminary think about how to respond to some of those intense challenges that they are facing, including inflation, which we might think is bad here, but it's way worse in Africa, especially in places like Nigeria, Ghana, and Egypt. The post-COVID pressure for seminaries to offer online theological education, which is kind of crazy in a place that doesn't have consistent internet or electricity, but that's what people keep asking for. So that's something they have to keep thinking about. And the ongoing cultural and interreligious tensions and violence. So the seminary program is helping Sunday in his seminary think about how they behave responsibly as an institution in that setting. Despite the burdens of executive leadership, Sunday is a prolific theologian. He's written and contributed to many books on his personal experiences with violence in Nigeria. Through his leadership and scholarship, he is shaping the lives of thousands of pastors, evangelists, and rising theologians across Africa. He is living out a faith that puts Christ at the center of every decision he makes, and that challenges others to do the same as he cares for the marginalized and advances reconciliation and care. Over the past 40 years, Sunday has transformed from that teenager just starting to learn how to read so that he could study the Gospel of John for himself, to a prominent voice engaging Africa's churches in some of the ways that they need most. I want to tell a slightly shorter story about someone who is in the PhD program right now. So he's someone I know well, better than Sunday. Sunday graduated long before I started working for Scholar Leaders. Medhat Tadros from Egypt is still working on his PhD. In Cairo, Egypt, believe it or not, the largest non-Coptic seminary was founded by Scottish Presbyterians in the 19th century. And they still subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith today. In fact, I had this weird moment a couple of years ago when I was sitting next to one of my coworkers who's from Egypt, who was faculty for this seminary, when we both looked at each other and realized, wait, you know what the Westminster Confession of Faith is? And you actually agree with it? That's crazy. He didn't think there were any Americans who knew anything about that because it was too conservative, and I didn't think there were any Egyptians who knew anything about that because they're Egyptians. But here we were having this conversation, so that was just this lovely moment. Well, that seminary realized that the history of Christianity in Egypt has mainly been written by Westerners, oddly enough, given that the history of Christianity in Egypt goes all the way back to Augustine of Hippo, who was an Egyptian Christian. So this seminary sent Medhat to come to the US to earn his PhD in church history. He will be the first indigenous Egyptian church historian for the Protestant church in Egypt. He was born and raised in an Egyptian Protestant family, a Reformed tradition very similar to our own beliefs and practices here. And in his research now, he's seeking to help Christians in the Middle East understand their Christian history in new ways. And you might say, well, it's good and it's fine, right? We just want a church historian. That's great. That's wonderful in and of itself. But the interesting thing that's happening in Egypt is that the nationalism that I mentioned at the beginning is popping up there in ways that say that if you want to be Egyptian, you have to be Muslim. You cannot be both Egyptian and anything other than Muslim. You must be a Muslim, which creates obvious problems for Christians, right? Not just in terms of truth, but also in terms of their identity and their life in that society. So Medhat's research will help Christians think about how to push back against that idea graciously, without endangering their own lives, how to live as Christians and Egyptians at the same time. And against that backdrop, it might be helpful for me to say, if you happen to look at the Scholar Leaders website, and you notice language there that makes you a little bit uncomfortable, whether that has to do with the Muslim majority context, or whether that's some of the descriptions of the PhD topics that people are studying, I'd invite you to take a step back for a moment and remember that the leaders whom Scholar Leaders serves are working in tremendously fraught contexts. At this time last year, I was talking to a young man from northeastern India who was telling me that he and his wife were really nervous, and I didn't really understand why, until he told me that Hindu nationalists were moving through their city, vandalizing and wrecking houses that weren't flying the Indian flag. Now, we might think, of course you fly your country's flag outside your house. That's fine, no problem, right? We might have an American flag outside our house. We have one right up here on the stage. But there, flying the Indian flag means that you're standing in solidarity with Hindu nationalism. And so they weren't going to do that as Christians. But that was putting them in danger. So I'd invite you to remember that even little things like that, like a phrase on a website, might mean that someone's passport gets revoked so that they can't travel for research or fellowship with other Christians. It might mean that they can't get a supplementary job to add to their income as a pastor because they're probably only getting paid quarter time for full-time work. It might mean that their loved ones are in danger. So Scholar Leaders tries to protect those whom we serve and our staff in these difficult contexts by using language that may sound a little odd or vague to us from our standpoint here in the West. Well, I hope these stories have helped to make Scholar Leaders' work a little clearer for you. I hope that they've helped to illustrate two things about Scholar Leaders. This passage is one that I keep coming back to. In my moments in ministry, those of you who serve in ministry, you know that sometimes you ask yourself, why am I here and why am I doing this? This is really hard and it's really draining in a lot of ways. But I keep coming back to this passage because it illustrates two things for me. And the first thing is the what. Ephesians 4, Paul is talking about how Christ has equipped the church. Most basically, in my moments of questioning, I remember that these leaders with whom Scholar Leaders works are Christ's gift to the global church, and that includes us. Paul writes that Christ gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Christ has given these pastors, these counselors, these teachers, these missionaries, these evangelists, these entrepreneurs to the global church. They are his gift, and it is our privilege to get to help them grow into that gifting, to become, to develop, to mature, so that then they can help us, the believers in the pews, the students in the rows of their seminary classrooms, the widows and orphans, the displaced, come to know Christ and to see Christ in their own contexts. The other thing I hope these stories illustrates is the how of Scholar Leaders, because those verses that I just read, I actually yanked right out of the heart of that passage. This is how Paul opens, and this is how he closes that passage. And these verses really encapsulate or epitomize for me how Scholar Leaders does its work. Paul writes, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. Now, the end of that passage really goes back to the what, right? Those leaders, those gifts who are the joints, the parts of the body, who are all together necessary for the church to grow in love. But the first part, how Paul begins the passage, is really a description of how Scholar Leaders aspires to work in these contexts. For one thing, it takes a lot of patience to see someone through a PhD program, like 3 to 6 or 7 years, right? Shepherding them at every step of that way until they go home. Scholar Leaders also seeks to work with humility and gentleness in these difficult contexts, to come to the seminaries, to come to those topical issues, and not to say, how can we as Westerners impose a perspective on you, but rather, what do you need and how can we help you in Christ achieve your full potential in the church? So over my years working for Scholar Leaders, I've been impressed by its spirit of humility and gentleness, recognizing that as an American Christian, I don't have all the answers. My sisters and brothers in the majority world see things about Scripture that don't even cross my mind from their cultural perspectives and backgrounds. So partly this is a little bit selfish because I hope and I want us to learn from them. I think they have tremendous insight to offer us into how to live out the gospel, into who God is and what he is doing in the world that stretches, again, far beyond our own context here. But I also see Scholar Leaders helping that whole body, the global body of Christ, to grow and mature. These local believers know the heresies, the pressures, the persecutions of Christians on the ground far better than we do. And they are equipped to apply the gospel to those struggles in ways that no one else can. They can challenge the church in those contexts from within itself, rather than being outside voices that might spark resistance. Right? I'd always rather hear criticism from someone who knows and loves me well. They can come alongside the church in those places and say, let's push back against the prosperity gospel, for example. Let's push back against some of these ideas that might be creeping into the church that are untrue. They can do that in ways that really can be much more fruitful and not spark resistance or frustration. They can also encourage the church in these contexts with real love because they are sharing its sufferings on the ground. Our friends in Ukraine told me a story a couple of weeks ago. We have this WhatsApp chat where they post updates. The soldiers in the trenches are receiving Bibles from the Ukrainian Bible Society. And a Christian soldier, Cyril, started to read Psalm 91 in the trench, and as he was reading Psalm 91 aloud in the trench, Russians started to shell them. So he was reading those words about God being his shelter aloud while the shells were falling around him. As he was reading, a soldier next to him said, I have never been to church. I've never even walked through the doors of a church. But you gave me a Bible, and I started to read the Psalms. And God has come to me here in the mud and the filth of war. I have found God in this place where I never expected to see him. So the next time we read or sing Psalm 91, I'd invite us to remember these global Christian leaders who bit by bit, seed by seed, Bible by Bible, class by class, sermon by sermon, are bringing the light of Christ into these dark places and into these problems that seem so far and beyond anything that we could ever have anything to do with. God is working there in those places through these Christians, and it is a delight to get to serve alongside them. Well, I hope you are wondering, perhaps, how you might get involved with Scholar Leaders. There are two ways that I'd invite you to think about joining in our ministry. The first one is to subscribe to our prayer community, so the link is up there. You can just type in the message box there that you'd like to join the prayer community. And every week you'll get an update from one of these mustard seed leaders around the world. There'll be a cultural sort of explanation to help you understand their context, and then a personal letter from them, and then personal prayer requests. So one of the richest, one of the best ways you can partner with Scholar Leaders is to learn about these contexts and to pray for these people from a perspective of understanding and of Christian love and unity. Please pray for them. They need it. They value it. they tell me that they've just been astonished by how encouraging it is to know that Christians in the West are praying for them because they know that they're not alone. The second thing you can do is give. And I don't often make this request so explicitly, but I'm going to do that now for one major reason. This is the scholarship selection season right now, so it will run from December through February. This is the time of year when we are choosing those who will receive new scholarships. This year we've had 140 applicants, and we will probably only be able to give 6 scholarships. That's half as many as we would normally be able to give. That's half as many leaders who get to come into this lifelong relationship of resourcing Christian fellowship and Christian engagement in their own ministries. There are a lot of factors behind that. Believe it or not, one of them is still COVID. I know we thought maybe we'd move beyond that, but students who started their PhDs during COVID were not able to access academic resources the way they should have. And so they're taking a little bit longer to finish. But each of those people who take longer to finish means one fewer scholarship now, post-COVID. So I'd invite you to consider whether in this Christmas season you might give to help support this work of scholar leaders as we try to partner with the global Christian church to help it grow, to help it be the light of Christ in these dark places. And last of all, I want to share 2 prayer requests. These are more personal from the ministry itself. You won't see these in that prayer community. These are just for us only, just for those who are watching. The first one here is for choosing those new PhD scholarship recipients. As I said, that process started at the beginning of the month and it will run through mid-February. Please pray for wisdom. Please pray for wisdom for me as I lead this process. Please pray for wisdom for the staff who counsel me as I try to make decisions. And please pray for the selection committee who make the ultimate choice. So I will send a roster of finalists to the selection committee, and then they will actually choose the 6 who will receive scholarships this year. Please, please pray for that process. It's a very difficult process this year, given the need and then the constraint on our side. The second request up here is for the seminary counseling program. I actually just found out on Thursday, after I finalized this PowerPoint, that the primary staff counselor I mentioned here, his health situation is so severe that he is leaving scholar leaders altogether, which obviously gives us a huge gap in our ministry. So please pray for my colleagues who are trying to figure out how to keep this program going forward in his absence. It's a global program with a lot of moving pieces, so it's not an easy one. And then please pray for him and his family as they seek to get him the medical care that he needs. It's been a very difficult year for them. So again, I'd invite your prayer and your support for this ministry. We've got a little bit of time before we have to wrap up, so I would be happy to answer questions, any questions you might have, and then maybe we can spend a little time in prayer. Yeah. What's limiting the number of applicants? For applications themselves or for scholarships? Yep. That is because of that COVID delay. So we've got quite a few students who should have only taken maybe 4 or 5 years to finish their PhDs, and instead they're taking 5 to 6 years. So you might think of it as a classroom full of seats. All of those chairs are occupied right now, so I can't bring into the door new people because there are no empty seats, so to speak. Funding. Yeah, it's really funding. Yeah, thank you, sorry. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. It's really funding. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So I'm just curious, it's just a question about how it sort of works internally. So do you review all 140
I've been spending the last 2 weeks doing. Yes. I'm a little cross-eyed from looking at my iPad.
And then, how many do you send to the board? You just, and then that's 6 on your.
Yeah.
How many do you send to the 140? I'm just curious how.
Yeah, so maybe I should put it in context also, just to help flesh it out a bit more. 140, again, that's the highest number we've ever received. We got 120 last year. We thought that was a lot. And then I opened the form right after Thanksgiving, and I was like, oh, well, I guess I have my work cut out for me now. So 140 is the most we've ever gotten. Normally, we would send 20 to 25 to the committee. So we get from 140 to 20 to 25. But because I want to make it a little easier on the committee this year, and we have only 6 slots, I'm only sending 18. And I can give you a breakdown about the regions, where they each come from and all that if you're interested, but yeah. Yes, you would like that? Okay. So one of the lovely things that I'm so excited about this year, it's really hard here, but one of the things I'm super excited about is we consistently get massive piles of applications from Africa. Anglophone and Francophone Africa. Those guys, they just want their PhDs, man. They're burning down the houses to get their PhD. And it's not always for the best motives, maybe. I mean, there are certain other things at play there. But that being said, there's a huge need for educated people in Africa. So this year, finally, I'm able to send a good number of applicants from Anglophone and Francophone Africa. And Francophone is particularly difficult because the language barrier just makes it really, really hard to communicate. And sometimes the resources for education are much more constrained there too. So finally, we've got folks from Anglophone and Francophone Africa going for their PhDs. We've got a guy from Ukraine. We've got a guy from Kazakhstan who is studying how the gospel grew in the gulags during the Soviet Union, which is just amazing. We've got a woman from East Asia who will be faculty at an underground seminary who, believe it or not, is studying the imprecatory Psalms and how they apply in that context, which I'm so excited about her work. Not biased at all. And then we have some folks from Latin America as well. The odd thing is this year we don't have anyone from the Middle East, but we've taken a lot of Egyptians in past years, and we've got a couple of Lebanese folks also. So if you go to the website, you'll still see a good representation from the Middle East. This year, the need was greater in other contexts. So, oh, and I forgot, we've got an Indian, a Vietnamese, and a Filipino woman, too. Yes. Yes, John.
You talked about the importance, and I would totally agree with this, of learning from these people as they're going through the work and applying in their local context. What are some of the best ways or some of the most important ways that we can help support that learning coming into the church in the West? Like how do we reap the benefits of these people's work in their local context?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I have to say is that Scholar Leaders is hoping to do more of that. So we have a new president. He's been with SL for about 2 years now. And one of his goals is to help make that bridge more effective. Because one of the things we've been sort of disappointed by is how hard it is to make that happen. So things like he'd like to start a podcast, stuff to sort of make this theology more accessible for us on the ground. One thing, if you're interested, I would be happy to share books with you, to give you titles that have been helpful for me. Read the prayer community, because often the prayer community updates will mention people's publications, and there's a whole sidebar that lists that. And if you go to the Scholar Leaders Facebook page, every month we highlight someone's publication. So if you want to start by reading, that's a good way to do it. But then I hope, and the new president also hopes, that we'll be able to do some other ways to kind of build that bridge. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, 3 questions. One, you commit to scholarship is that for the whole period of time that they're in their program? What is the cost of that? A typical average, I'm sure it differs at different places. Two, how did Scholar Leaders get started? And three, were you introduced to it and get interested in it?
Yeah, okay, great questions, thank you. Okay, so the first one is, does the scholarship extend for the duration of the PhD program, and about how much is it? The answer is usually yes. We do stay with someone through the duration of their PhD program. That has become much harder more recently. So we've had to find some compromises because some people are taking even more than 6 years. We commit to someone for 6 years. But if they take more than that, we have to find compromises and ways to maybe give partial support or help them access other kinds of resourcing. So that's that. It's more complicated than it should be. Scholarships run anywhere from $3,000 to $18,000, and you might say, wow, that's a huge span. But that's because someone like this Kazakh guy that I mentioned earlier, who's a finalist, he will be living and working in his home context and studying part-time for his PhD. So he doesn't need a lot, right? It's the exchange rate there, other factors, he doesn't need a huge scholarship. But then we've got some folks here in the US who have spouses, children with them, they're in California or on the East Coast. We give them that $1,000 scholarship because they're studying full-time and they need as much help as they can get. And we want their families with them. We don't want families to be broken up. We want the families together. Yeah, so that's the range. That's kind of the picture there. You asked about how Scholar Leaders was founded. It was founded by 3 men who were study assistants for John Stott. So every time you guys mention John Stott, I get really happy because Scholar Leaders is a direct outgrowth from his ministry. He actually founded the British version of Scholar Leaders himself. And then these guys were Americans, and they founded the American version. So I work for the American version. I got involved with Scholar Leaders in 2019. I had finished my PhD at IU, and I was teaching composition and discovering that it was kind of killing my soul. And so I wanted a way to use my PhD, my gifts, my skills, but also have something that would be life-giving, that would really serve the church and have more meaning to it, honestly. And so I was very thankful for a friend who introduced me to Scholar Leaders. They were looking for someone to do communications, and so that's how I got started, sort of on the ground floor, and then I stepped in to direct the scholarship program. So I've been doing that for almost 3 years now. Yeah. Might have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Any other questions?
How do the people in other countries find out about you? Online, seminaries,
it can be any number of different things. So Scholar Leaders has supported over 300 people in the last 40 years. That's a big network. So those alumni will tell people who are up and coming about us. The seminaries, if we run the seminary counseling program at a seminary and they need faculty development, we'll take people who might be trying to get their PhDs through them. And then these topical programs that I mentioned, they also have networks. So they'll send out. And then at the beginning, in August, when our scholarship application opens, I actually send out a massive email to the theological accrediting bodies around the world. That sounds really dry, but the theological education accrediting associations, they know people on the ground. And so they will forward that email to all kinds of different folks who will then pass it on, and then I'll start to see those applications come in. So yeah, word of mouth, website, email, social media. We try to get as many as we can.
One of your slides, you said that you provided counsel to different organizations. What kind of counsel do you give?
Yeah, so the seminary counseling program, it works with the presidents and academic deans at seminaries usually, so sort of the executive leadership team. And the counseling is personal and spiritual because often in cultures, in those global cultures, we say high power distance, which means that if you're in a leadership position, like the president of a seminary, you're treated as you're on this pedestal. And there is no best friend to you, right? You're just out there, you have to be perfect and perform perfectly. Well, the Scholar Leaders staff are outsiders, so they can come in and sort of put an arm around that guy's shoulders and say, what are your issues? How can we help you personally? But they also do institutional strategic planning to say, okay, what do we need to do to get your alumni database up to date so that we can start fundraising? What issues are you having with your denomination, and how can we help you sort of work through some of those? Like some of those more, I know it put some of us, even me, to sleep sometimes, but some of those basic sort of institutional health questions, they help them deal with that too. Oh. Well, we're almost out of time. Philip, would you be willing to pray? Thank you.
Appreciated hearing about the work of Scholar Leaders Council. Probably for some, it's the first time for us, so it's very helpful. Yeah, I think encourage you to please pray for the work and what you did, and then I'll continue to the previous
Yeah. I guess let's go back to that.
websites, web addresses on there, consider doing. So let's pray. Father God, I thank you for and this picture of mustard seed. Your word, but world seems so small, so insignificant. Yet that's why you work. You work through individuals. So Lord, I thank you for the work of Scholar Leaders, Trina, individuals, and study, learn, and then to go out. Whether that's for churches, whether that's for seminaries, whether it's to begin ministry themselves, and do pray, Lord. You equip them, and we thank you for this opportunity that they're getting to get this third level education and seminary training. And so, Father, I just pray you bless this work. I pray particularly for Ellen, she has this shrewd 140 applications and about 15 and whatnot. Do the best and to receive this moment. So I do pray that you help her in this work, give her strength in that responsibility. Father, we pray particularly for this gentleman who's not well, for healing on him, and also not in the gospel. And has been established in this seminary counselor position. And we're praying that you find someone who has the skills, ability, and the council seminaries